Good morning, students. I hope all is well. Here we are at the end of the year. This is our last module. Okay, we're in module 15. Remember, we're going back to that one. And furthermore, we're actually on module 15B. That has to do with the fact that the urinary and endocrine systems are very complex and full of so much awesome information that my lecture's a little longer this time, and I have a short lab. And then next week when we cover the lymphatic system, which will be the last system of the human body, it'll be a little bit shorter, and we'll have the longer lab, which is the dissection of the rat. Okay, so what I want you to do then is go ahead and turn to page 72 in your student activity manual, and we will start to work on filling in some of the blanks. Okay, let's start with the urinary system. And here's our first blank. The urinary system controls the water in your body. All right, that's a very oversimplified way of saying what the urinary system is doing. It is incredibly complex, and it's incredibly important because you know how important water is. Our body needs to have the right amount. We don't want too much water. We don't want too little water. And so our kidneys are in charge of that. Our urinary system's in charge of that. I've also been very fascinated with the urinary system my whole life. I just think it's fascinating. And I think that has to do with the fact that my uncle is a world-renowned nephrologist. And a nephrologist is a kidney doctor. And I'll get into some of that later, some of his innovations, which help with people who had kidney problems. And he came up with some important medical devices for that. All right, so let's see what it's made up of. So when I have that little star up there, it means we have a little chart in your book to fill in on page 72. It's all on page 72. So we're going to be looking at the structures of the urinary system now. First of all, we have the renal arteries. All right, you can see the artery, it comes into each of the kidneys like this, okay? And then we have the kidneys, 1, 2, everybody, normally, you're born with 2 kidneys. We have the ureters, which take urine from the kidney, where it is manufactured, down into the bladder. And then we have the urethra, which is the exit from the body, okay, from the bladder to the outside of the body. All right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things you're writing down right there. This really could say renal artery and vein complex right there, because we're taking blood in and taking blood out as well. So the kidneys need a lot of blood supply. So you can see right here, those are all kind of together in the abdominal area in our peritoneal cavity. It's called the peritoneal cavity, meaning that it's underneath the diaphragmatic muscle right there. So it's separated from our lungs, right? Naturally, because the lungs need to have that negative pressure in there. So it's all in your belly area. All right, that little star says write those down. If you need to pause this to have more time to write that, go right ahead. So let's talk about our kidneys. What is the function of the actual kidneys? There's 2 of them, okay? They're in your back. And notice one of them's just a little bit higher than the other one. It's just set that way, but they're set right next to your spinal cord in the back there, and they're highly protected. Let's see what their function is real quick. First of all, they filter the blood and remove waste products. All right. Next, they make urine. That seems kind of obvious, right? They keep balance in the body. That is known as homeostasis, and they do that through several ways. And that has to do with the water content of our body. It has to do with the salt content of our body. It has to do with hormones as well. And we'll learn about the hormones at the last part of this lecture. So they make some hormones. There they go. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 things you're going to write down right there on the little chart on page 72. Okay, so let's talk about those kidneys a little bit right here. Here's the anatomy of the kidney. So they are bean-shaped. If you've ever seen a kidney bean, they are called kidney beans because they look like kidneys. Okay, it's not the other way around as far as I know. And like I said, we have 2 of them, and they're kind of situated in the back of your body, and they're protected. They're highly protected by a layer of fat. Even very, very thin, even malnourished people will have fat surrounding their kidneys. And that's to keep their kidney from moving around inside the cavity in the back. They're snugly back there. You know, it's almost like the backbone is keeping them in place right there. And that has to do with this ureter that comes out of here. It's important that it not get kinked up in any way. We don't want it to get pinched off. because then the urine wouldn't have a free flow out of the body, and that could cause a big problem. That could cause the urine to back up inside each of the kidneys, and that is a disease that some people will have. Okay, so then you see they're fairly unassuming as far as their anatomy goes. They have that fat layer, like I said. The outside is called the cortex. Okay, so the cortex is right here, sort of this outer layer, and I'm talking about the inner layer, if you will, not the capsule. There's a capsule over it, but inside, when we cut it open, there we see that. In the middle part's called the medulla. So if you remember middle medulla, that would be right. Right here, we have these things called the renal. When you hear the word renal, that has to do with the kidney. Okay, anything renal, and we see right here these little triangular shaped things right here are called the renal pyramids. I guess they're kind of shaped like a little pyramid, right? I want you to think of them kind of like a funnel. All right, so what's happening is there are these structures inside the kidney right here that are filtering. They're actually little tiny filters, and then they're ending up with their little end tip right there, dropping all of the urine that's been made into these little funnels. Then the little funnels, the renal pyramids, drop it into the renal pelvis, and then that collects into the ureter. Okay, and then it goes to the bladder right there. So we have about 8 to 18 renal pyramids per kidney. I have, with my Biology 2 kids, my A and P students, we dissect kidneys, and oftentimes, I only teach that every other year, but typically when I'm teaching it, I'll bring a kidney to show to y'all. But I will confess they're really fairly, unremarkable as far as a dissection goes. There's not a whole lot to see. You kind of have to dig in there to find those renal pyramids. The most fascinating part of the kidney is not visible because it's so tiny. You need a microscopic look at it to see that part. All right, so the rest of these words in here you don't need to worry about so much. Just know that we have those little structures inside, those little pyramids inside the kidney there. Let's watch a little video that gives us an overview of the renal.
It's a hot day, and you've just downed several glasses of water, one after the other. Behind the sudden urge that follows are two bean-shaped organs that work as fine-tuned internal sensors. They balance the amount of fluid in your body, detect waste in your blood, and know when to release the vitamins, minerals, and hormones you need to stay alive. Say hello to your kidneys. The main role of these organs is to dispose of waste products and to turn them into urine. The body's 8 liters of blood pass through the kidneys between 20 and 25 times each day, meaning that together, these organs filter about 180 liters every 24 hours. The ingredients in your blood are constantly changing as you ingest food and drink, which explains why the kidneys need to be on permanent duty. Blood enters each kidney through arteries that branch and branch until they form tiny vessels that entwine with special internal modules called nephrons. In each kidney, 1 million of these nephrons form a powerful array of filters and sensors that carefully sift through the blood. This is where we see just how refined and accurate this internal sensing system is. To filter the blood, each nephron uses 2 powerful pieces of equipment, a blob-like structure called a glomerulus, and a long stringy straw-like tubule. The glomerulus works like a sieve, allowing only certain ingredients, such as vitamins and minerals, to pass into the tubule. Then, this vessel's job is to detect whether any of those ingredients are needed in the body. If so, they're reabsorbed in amounts that the body needs so they can circulate in the blood again. But the blood doesn't only carry useful ingredients. It contains waste products too, and the nephrons have to figure out what to do with them. The tubules sense compounds the body doesn't need, like urea, left over from the breakdown of proteins, and redirects them as urine out of the kidneys and through 2 long sewers called ureters. These tubes empty their contents into the bladder to be discharged, ridding your body of that waste once and for all. There's water in that urine too. If the kidney detects too much of it in your blood, for instance, when you've chugged several glasses at once, it sends the extra liquid to the bladder to be removed. On the other hand, low water levels in the blood prompt the kidney to release some back into the bloodstream, meaning that less water makes it into the urine. This is why urine appears yellower when you're less hydrated. By controlling water, your kidneys stabilize the body's fluid levels. But this fine balancing act isn't the kidney's only skill. These organs have the power to activate vitamin D to secrete a hormone called renin that raises blood pressure, and another hormone called erythropoietin, which increases red blood cell production. Without the kidneys, our bodily fluids would spiral out of control. Every time we ate, our blood would receive another load of unsifted ingredients. Soon, the buildup of waste would overload our systems and we'd expire. So each kidney not only keeps things running smoothly, it also keeps us alive. Lucky then that we have 2 of these magical beans.
Okay, so see how important they are? My goodness gracious, yeah, you cannot live without your kidneys. So they filter waste. This is probably the thing you already knew about kidneys, right? So there are 200 quarts of blood daily pass through the kidneys. Wow. I mean, there is just a lot of action happening here. Okay, think of if the circulatory system's like a giant highway, we can think of the kidneys as the big, spaghetti thing they have to go through, right? The turns and twists they have to go through to get cleaned up, to get washed off, the car wash, if you will. 2 quarts of waste products and extra water combine to form urine. And the waste products are the result of normal activities, okay, like using your muscles to break down of proteins. Certain things that we eat that we don't use, that we don't utilize, or we have too much of. For instance, right now, perhaps you might be taking more vitamin C because of this illness going around. So we're all worried about catching stuff, so we take vitamin C. Well, one of the reasons you don't have to worry about taking too much vitamin C is that the urine will excrete, the kidneys will excrete any extra vitamin C that you don't need. All right, so there's no worries right there. So it will treat it as waste, if you will. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at that blood flow that comes in. Okay, so this is pretty fascinating because what happens is that the blood comes in, just regular circulating blood comes in the arteries, right? And it goes in through to those special structures that were mentioned in the video, those structures called nephrons. All right, remember I told you my uncle's a nephrologist. That's where that word comes from. And then after it's filtered, it's cleaned out, and then it leaves through the vein back to the body, okay? So here we have dirty blood, if you will, and here we have clean blood. And the dirty stuff becomes urine and goes down to the bladder right there. So renal artery to the nephrons to the renal vein. And then, of course, urine through the ureter. Okay, so that's the blood flow going through there. Let's get a little closer. Now let's take a look at those nephrons. Now, fascinating to me is there's 2 things happening here. We have the blood supply, which is red, okay? And then we have the nephron, which is this blue tubule right here. See how it's a long tubule? Here we have this thing called the loop of Henle. And then down here, this is our collecting duct. It will end up in the renal pyramid and then dumping the stuff that goes in there. There are about 1 million nephrons per kidney. It turns out that that's where all the filtering is taking place. It's taking place right in here, okay? This thing right here, the blue part, the part of the nephron, is called the Bowman's capsule, and the blood coming into it is called the glomerulus. You saw that in the video. All right, so what happens is this comes right in to a very sensitive filter on the inside of the Bowman's capsule, and then it shoots a bunch of stuff through there. Basically, all the liquid portion of your blood goes into the nephron. Isn't that crazy? All the liquid portion of your blood goes into the nephron, into the blue tubule right here. But we don't want all of the liquid portion out of our blood, right? Can you think of blood being kind of like dry? Notice how that blood vessel immediately is hooked up right around the nephron right here. Guess why? So the fluid, the water, goes right back into the blood. So in my A&P class, we talk about, for instance, if you're going to clean out the junk drawer at your house, the most efficient way to clean out the junk drawer is just to dump everything out of it and then start putting back in the things you want. That's kind of what's happening in our nephrons right here. Everything is dumped out, and then the kidney gets to decide what stuff is going to go back in to the blood, okay? So all this blood supply here next to the nephron is all getting stuff back into it, and the bad stuff stays in the nephron. All right, and it will eventually become urine. So for instance, I'm gonna put through the blood all of the sugar, like all the glucose, right, that's in my blood. We need that for our muscles to work, right, to make our ATP. Well, so then my glucose is going to go right back into my blood because I need it, unless there's too much glucose in your blood. And then some glucose can stay in your urine, and we'll get to that. That's going to be a typical disease that we have, a common disease around here, and we'll talk about that. So what happens to it? So there's our Bowman's capsule. We've sort of straightened out the nephron right here, okay, so it's not so convoluted. And so the glomerulus, remember, that's the blood coming in. Here's our Bowman's capsule. See how it's encapsulating it, right? And this is like a net of blood vessels, and that blood comes slamming into the wall of the Bowman's capsule. The Bowman's capsule has to be very securely held in place, and it is by certain cells that are holding it in place. And as that blood comes and slams up against the wall, think of a fire hose spraying through a really strong screen window. All right, so if you spray it through a screen window, the water will all go through the screen, right? And that's exactly what's happening here. If our fire hose had some solid parts to it, I don't know what that would be, but let's say it did, the solid parts would not go through the screen, but the water would. So the solid parts of the blood do not go through unless there's damage. And so the solid part stays in the blood vessel, and all the liquid goes through. All right, so right here it gets to the proximal, that means nearby, so near the Bowman's capsule, the proximal tubule. It's actually called the proximal convoluted tubule because it's so windy like this. Lots of surface area there. And what's happening here? The water's going back into the bloodstream. Sodium is going back into the bloodstream. Amino acids are going back in. Glucose is all going back in. All right, so now all the liquid portion that needs to be back in the blood is now back in the blood, okay? And it's going to go down, it's going to reach down far into our kidney, into the thing called the loop of Henle. And the loop of the Henle reaches down into the medulla of the kidney. And interestingly, the medulla of the kidney, it's very salty in there. Isn't that strange? It's very salty. And what that does is it allows more water to pass through back into the blood. So we can, remember, regulate that water. So the water goes back into my blood. The descending loop of Henle right here, the one part going down, is the part that takes the water back in. The ascending loop of Henle will actually deal with the salt. Do I have too much salt? Then I can actually put salt back into the urine and get rid of it. We don't want too much sodium in there. Interestingly, at this point right here, this is active transport that takes place, which keeps, actually water doesn't go over anymore at this point. And that's because the ascending loop of Henle is impermeable to water in certain conditions. There's a hormone that our kidney produces that will make this area permeable to water if we need more water. I mean, it's fascinating to me. That's amazing. So our kidneys can say, oh, I need more water. Let's release this hormone. And now we'll get that more water from there. Crazy. All right, back up here, we have some more sodium and water going back in if we need to. Here's the hormone, the aldosterone I'm talking about. And then that hormone right here will affect the collecting tubule, and it will make the collecting tubule either permeable or non-permeable to water. If I need more water in the blood, it'll go out here. If I don't, it'll stay in. And that collecting tubule will then end up, see, notice it's going through the medulla of the kidney as well. All right, so the salty part of the kidney. And that'll be emptied out into the renal pyramids and turn into urine, which will end up in the bladder, which will end up in outside the body. So, renal artery to the nephrons, to the renal pelvis, to the ureter, to the bladder. So making urine, that's what happens to it. Now let's look at the hormonal side of kidneys. Okay, we're going to be looking at our endocrine system here in a minute, and this is going to be part of that. So this is going to cross over between the two of those. Kidneys make something called EPO, erythropoietin. That was in the video, erythropoietin. And erythro, remember, that's red blood cells. All right, erythrocytes, right? And so that's going to regulate red blood cell production. What in the world do the kidneys have to do with red blood cell? Well, think about it. That blood is coming into the Bowman's capsule there, right, in the glomerulus. And my kidneys know right then, those nephrons register right then, wow, I have a lot of red blood cells. I don't have enough red blood cells. And so it could say, wow, I'm getting a little anemic. I need more red blood cells. I'm going to release this erythropoietin, and it's going to go to the bone marrow and tell the bone marrow, make more red blood cells. Fascinating. That's crazy. We have other ones here too. We have aldosterone. This is the one that affects the permeability of the nephrons to absorb or not water back into the blood. We have other ones, post-pituitaries. We have something called parathyroid, PTH. We have that renin that was mentioned in the video. We have this long name one right here, right, that helps with absorption in our gut. So they really keep our bodies so healthy. Just these two little beans, those are crazy that they're in there. And by the way, you can live with just one kidney. So kidneys are one of the most commonly donated organs for people who have bad kidneys, because you can just live with one. In fact, if one that's only working half way, it still can do the job. They're so efficient. God has designed these so beautifully. I just praise God for our kidneys. Now, if you have a problem with your kidneys, I kind of like this picture. This is a plastic model over here. That's showing where a nephron would be. All right. So I guess the Bowman's capsule would be here. These are two nephrons. A Bowman's capsule. Here's our loop of Henle coming back up in here, and then the collecting tubule. Bowman's capsule, loop of Henle, and down like this. I will say that not every nephron has a loop of Henle. Not all of them reach down into the medulla that way, but a good number of them do. And it's the representative ones that do that. So that's why I showed that to you. So people who are diabetic, what happens with them is that here's two things. Okay, we're going to talk about these two different types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. All right, type 1 is a disease you're born with, and type 2 is one that develops over time. And what happens is that the body is unable to produce enough of the hormone that takes the glucose into the cells. And remember that glucose needs to be in the cells to make ATP. All right, since we don't have that hormone that takes that in there, the glucose doesn't go into the cells, it stays in the blood, and the kidneys can't figure out. They're like, oh my goodness, there's so much glucose here. So the kidneys start to keep glucose in the urine. So that's one of the ways people get diagnosed with diabetes, is if they have glucose in their urine. The glucose should not be in your urine. The glucose should be in your cells. Okay, so that will cause a problem. So that will start to damage the nephrons. With too much glucose going in there. Furthermore, if there are certain drugs or other excess hormones, ammonia is one of the chemicals that is part of urine. Urea and ammonia are made in there. And so what happens is ammonia gets changed into urea, from uric acid into urea. And that's less toxic to the kidney. So if there's a problem or a disease that we can't transfer that over, then that can cause damage to the nephrons. And if our nephrons get clogged, they're little tubes, right? And those little tubes get clogged up, that's a serious problem. They cannot filter anymore. So how do we test these things? Right here, when I would do urinalysis, called the urinalysis, on animals all the time, right? We'd have to collect the urine. That was the tough part. Interestingly, like cats, for instance, would come in, and they tend to, tomcats, male cats, have very, very small urethra. And because of that, sometimes they can get little solid particles that clog it up, and they can't urinate anymore. And people would bring their cat in and say, my cat goes to the litter box all the time, but he's really not acting right. And we would feel the bladder, and it would be like a softball size in their abdomen full of urine, because they can't empty their bladder because it's blocked. It's called the blocked Tom syndrome. And so we would do a urinalysis on them to see if we could figure out why they were blocked. And on those cats, just to be graphic with you a little bit, we actually stuck a needle in their bladder and got the urine sample that way, right? Yeah. And that's how typically we would get it from an animal. From a human, you just would urinate into a cup like this and put a lid on it, and then you would send it to the laboratory. And then the laboratory will test it for several things. First thing they're going to do is dip this stick into it. All right, if you have a pool, you know how those sticks work. They test for chemicals. And so we dip it in there, and we check the little pads to see if there's certain high levels of certain things. Okay, so it tells me it's low on this side, high on this side. This one looks like it's doing all right. No high levels right there, but that gives us an indication. Is there protein in the urine? Is there glucose in the urine? Are there white blood cells? That means maybe an infection going on. All that can be told by this little stick. But then once we have a little preliminary diagnostic with that stick, then we can take that urine and test it for other things. We can see if, how much glucose is in there. We can see what type of protein is in there. And then we would take the urine, so we do some other diagnostics on it. And then we would take that urine and we would spin it down in a centrifuge, and at the bottom I would end up with the little solid particles. And I could see some of those solid particles that might be causing that tomcat's problem. And therefore, what we would typically do for those guys is first of all, we would unblock them by putting a catheter in their urethra, and then draining their bladder, of course, and then usually giving them vitamin C, which would help to acidify the bladder, and secondly, to change their diet. Oops, sorry about that. All right, so this is the kind of stuff that I would see in the microscope when I spun it down and found some solid portions in the urine. So you can see some of these little crystals right here. Okay, these crystals, some of them are normal, but if there are a lot of the crystals, we can say, okay, this animal might have been exposed to something. I believe it's this crystal right here, because I was the lab technician. I would look these up, and when I would see these right here, I would have a book to compare them to. I didn't have to memorize all of them, but I remember that square-looking one over there. We had a dog come in one time who was just acting very strangely. It was bleeding a lot. You know, he would get cut and bleed a lot. And so we did a urinalysis just to get an idea of what's going on with this dog. And when I found these crystals in there, I knew right away what was wrong with the dog. The dog had poisoned himself by drinking the liquid we put in our car called antifreeze. Okay, so antifreeze is something that keeps our car from freezing up, the water in our car from freezing up in the wintertime. And typically in the summertime, people will empty that out, you know, and not use it. They only use it in the wintertime. But it happens to be very sweet flavored. It has a sweet taste, but it's also poisonous. And so dogs, if they found it, they would lick it up and like it, and then would poison them. And so when I found those, I'd say, okay, it looks like he got exposed to this chemical. And we would ask the owners, did you just change the antifreeze in your car? And they would say, oh my goodness, yes I did, and I didn't throw that liquid out. Okay, well there you go. And then we could treat them with the proper drugs for that. They'd be okay as long as they didn't have too much of it. So that's how a urinalysis can be very, very helpful. This just shows you, if I have those solid portions in there, what part of the nephron they got collected in. Okay, we call them casts, epithelial casts, white blood cell casts, this kind of thing. So all those would indicate certain diseases that might be going on in the animal and human, of course, for the same thing. Oh, and here's a disease that happens to humans and to other animals as well. We can sometimes, some of those solid portions can sometimes collect up inside the kidney itself. They just kind of build on each other and build on each other, and that is called a kidney stone. And kidney stones can become very problematic if they get stuck right here. Okay, notice how this is going to back all of the urine up into the kidney right there. So this is a problem, right? It's blocking it. By the way, this will be very, very painful. In fact, the patient will present with a problem of, I've got a serious backache. My back really, really hurts. Well, and then they'll check this. They'll say, oh, you've got a kidney stone. All right, so a couple of ways to get rid of a kidney stone. Oftentimes what you can do is it's interesting, you can put the patient in a bathtub that has a way of making the water, how would you say that? Not like a whirlpool, but it would vibrate the water. And it would be like a zzz, like this, and the vibrations would actually break up these little stones, and they would come out through the urine. The other way, of course, would be surgically go in and remove them. Hopefully you would catch them before there's a whole lot of damage, and after that, damage to the kidney. And after that, the patient would probably have to go on a diet that had less calcium, for instance, whatever was causing that stone to form in the first place. Okay, if people have kidneys that aren't functioning properly, like I said before, it's one of the most common transplant surgeries out there, because since we have two, we can give a kidney away to someone. And so if someone's having trouble, they're not filtering their blood properly. And if they're not filtering their blood properly, then those toxins will start to build up inside their bodies. And that will cause them to, over time, slowly poison themselves. Okay, so that's bad news, right? So a kidney transplant is an option. So a donor will supply a kidney. It has to match. You know, they have to go through this pretty long process of matching blood types and what we call complement types, and all these little different markers that would make you see whether or not you were a good match for someone. All right, and then the new kidney would be put in. I never knew this when I was growing up, but I assumed they took the diseased kidney out. It turns out they leave it in there. They leave it in there because it may be functioning a little bit, and they put that transplanted kidney right down there. Isn't that crazy looking? They hook up a blood supply to it. They keep the ureter from the original donor, and they hook it into the ureter of the patient. So therefore, And it says we usually keep the other, unless the original kidneys were cancerous, they'll usually keep those in there like that. Fascinating. All right, so if your kidney's not working well, and maybe it's working a little bit, and you don't have a transplant, maybe you're on a list for a transplant or something, you may go through this process called kidney dialysis. Okay, so this is a procedure that saved many, many lives, but it is not easy. What you have to do is go sit down, probably 3 or 4 times a week, y'all. You sit down, you get your blood taken out of your arm. It goes through this giant machine, which is essentially a mechanical kidney, all right? And it's taking it's filtering out all the waste, and then your blood is going into there, and then the clean blood is coming back into you, all right? So it comes back into you. This takes many hours to do this, and you have to do it 3 or 4 times a week for many hours. It's very, very disruptive to your life, but it'll save your life. Okay, so it's a miracle that somebody figured this out. Well, it was my uncle who came up with this. So he's a world-renowned nephrologist for this reason. He came up with something known as continuous ambulatory peritoneal dialysis, CAPD. And what you can do is there is a fluid, you wear a bag, and that bag goes through a catheter. So he invented this, he invented the process with other people, but he invented this catheter. In fact, it's called the Moncrief catheter. And that goes into your peritoneal cavity. So right into your peritoneal cavity. And then your fluid comes in, and that fluid is a very salty or very, whatever it's made up of for your needs. And it causes the waste to, by osmosis, go into that catheter, two-way, and go into your waste fluid bag right here. So we're wearing 2 bags, and then you of course have to replace the dialysate bag and replace, get rid of the waste bag. Now notice it's called continuous ambulatory. What that means right here is that it's all the time. It's happening all the time. Ambulatory means you're walking around. All right, so you're able to walk around and to proceed with life, not having to sit down for hours at a time right here like this. Peritoneal means that's where it is. It's in the peritoneal cavity right there. So it's pretty brilliant, and it has worked for lots and lots of people. And so of course it's not ideal. Maybe while you're waiting for a kidney transplant or something, this would be something that would be very useful to you. All right, that's it for our urinary system. As you can see, I'm very animated about it because I love it. I think it's fascinating. I should have been a nephrologist myself, right? Okay. All right, but now we're moving to the endocrine system, which was tied, as you saw, to the renal system. We can see right there, there's our kidney, and there furthermore is a gland on top of our kidney called the adrenal gland. All right, so on page 72, we have the endocrine system controls the chemical messengers found in the blood for body functions. So you're going to write that down in your blank. And then the next blank says hormone, and we're going to write this. Hormones are released and act on a target organ. Okay, so an organ releases it, and it goes to another place in the body to regulate, control, coordinate all of the functions in your body. Along with the brain, it is helping with that. Okay, we can see kind of a list over here to the right. That's not what I want you to write down just yet. That's showing you some of the different glands in the body. Here they are as well. Okay, so you're not writing this down either. But you can see they're throughout our whole body, throughout our whole trunk of our body. It starts in the brain, actually. And in our hypothalamus, we saw that. Remember the pituitary gland that was hanging gland? Okay, so it's the one telling all the other glands what to do. That's the pituitary gland, anterior, posterior, in the brain. All right, so the gland releases the hormone into the blood. That's important, into the bloodstream, where they're carried to other body parts. They're like keys that unlock the door to activities. Over 30 hormones orchestrate and regulate things like hunger, feeling full. When you get that hunger pain in there, that's a hormone saying, feed me. Sleep. It's hormones that help us to sleep and furthermore to stay awake. Our body temperature, our metabolism, handling stress. It's called the fight or flight response. That has to do with adrenaline. So that adrenaline in an emergency. And how and when you grow. So growth hormone, it helps with your bone growth, with your body growth. And so it's called human growth hormone. So here are the major players right here. This is what you're writing down in your book, the major glands of the endocrine system. So notice we're going to start with that, the hypothalamus right here in your brain. We saw that when I showed you the brain structures when we looked at that. So we start there. Then from the hypothalamus is the master gland called the pituitary gland. Then we have several other ones. There are many others, but these are the main ones that we will be talking about in this class. The thyroid gland, the parathyroid glands, the adrenal glands, the thymus gland, and the pancreas. All right, so you're going to write those down, but keep in mind there are more than those. All right, but those are the biggies, the big players here, the major players. All right, so you're going to write those down on your chart right there, and you can pause this if you need to. So let's say we're going to think of the hypothalamus as the coach. All right, it's going to control the whole game out there. It tells the pituitary gland what to do. It's very small in the brain. It's tiny. It's hanging off the there's the thalamus and the hypothalamus. It's hanging off right there, and the pituitary is the part. So there's the hypothalamus. This is the pituitary. So the hypothalamus itself is small. The pituitary is small. It's part of the brain. So that's the coach. And the pituitary gland is going to be the quarterback. So here it is hanging off the end of the hypothalamus. Called the master gland because it affects so many other glands. It controls growth, blood pressure. By the way, the kidneys have a lot to do with blood pressure too. You know, because that blood is coming into that capsule really hard like that. It can tell whether our blood pressure is high or low. Pretty cool. Thyroid gland function, metabolism, kidney function. There it is right there. Temperature regulation. It's only about the size of a pea. Wow. And it controls all that. And boy, howdy, you don't want your pituitary going wrong. Yeah, and so it needs to be functioning beautifully. And the vast majority of pituitary glands are functioning just perfectly. Yeah, there's not that many problems with pituitary glands. There can be a problem if, for instance, a tumor shows up on one or something like that. Let's start with our thyroid gland. It's right in our neck, in our throat. And it's shaped like a bow tie or a butterfly. It's right there. It is in charge of all of our metabolism, okay? Our body temperature, our weight. It kind of keeps us, if you're feeling kind of, tired or you're feeling kind of hyper, a lot of times your thyroid gland has something to do with that. It will help regulate bone growth and the development of the brain and the nervous system. Okay, I think, yes, I have a video on this. Here we go.
Nestled in the tissues of your neck is a small, unassuming organ that wields enormous power over your body. It's called the thyroid. Like the operations manager in a company, its role is to make sure that the cells in your body are working properly. It does that by using hormones to deliver messages to every single one of them. This high-ranking organ is made up of lobules that each contain smaller cells called follicles, which store the hormones the thyroid sends out into your blood. Two of the most important hormones it produces are thyroxine and triiodothyronine, or T3 and T4. As messengers, the hormone's job is to instruct every cell in the body when to consume oxygen and nutrients. That maintains the body's metabolism, the series of reactions our cells perform to provide us with energy. This hormonal notification from the thyroid gets the heart pumping more efficiently and makes our cells break down nutrients faster. When you need more energy, the thyroid helps by sending out hormones to increase metabolism. Ultimately, the thyroid allows our cells to use energy, grow, and reproduce. The thyroid is controlled by the pituitary gland, a hormonal gland deep in the brain that oversees the thyroid's tasks, making sure it knows when to send out its messengers. The pituitary's role is to sense if hormone levels in the blood are too low or too high, in which case it sends out instructions in the form of the thyroid-stimulating hormone. Even in this tightly controlled system, however, management sometimes slips up. Certain diseases, growths in the thyroid, or chemical imbalances in the body can confuse the organ and make it deaf to the pituitary's guiding commands. The first problem this causes is hyperthyroidism, which happens when the organ sends out too many hormones. That means the cells are overloaded with instructions to consume nutrients and oxygen. They become overactive as a result, meaning a person with hyperthyroidism experiences a higher metabolism, signaled by a faster heartbeat, constant hunger, and rapid weight loss. They also feel hot, sweaty, anxious, and find it difficult to sleep. The opposite problem is hypothyroidism, which happens when the thyroid sends out too few hormones, meaning the body's cells don't have as many messengers to guide them. In response, cells grow listless and metabolism slows. People with hypothyroidism see symptoms in weight gain, sluggishness, sensitivity to cold, swollen joints, and feeling low. Luckily, there are medical treatments that can help trigger the thyroid's activities again and bring the body back to a steady metabolic rate. For such a little organ, the thyroid wields an awful lot of power, but a healthy thyroid manages our cells so effectively that it can keep us running smoothly without us even noticing it's there.
Okay, so it's a little tiny thing, and it's doing so much for our body right here. So I mentioned in there hypothyroidism, not making enough, so it's an underproduction of thyroid hormone. And what happens is the patient will come in and feel tired all the time, maybe some unexplained weight gain. They get cold very easily. Their joints and muscles hurt. There might be some constipation, dry thinning hair, depression, slowed heart rate. Everything sort of just slows down. This is very common in women about my age that tend to just sort of die down and not have a lot of energy. We're very fortunate that we have been able to synthesize in a laboratory thyroxine, from animals and things like this. So we're able to replace that. So people who have a problem with hypothyroidism can actually just take thyroid medication, and it helps to regulate all that stuff. And so you get tested, and there's a lot of stuff going on right now about when you test thyroid, that you need to test a full range of the T3 and T4 and some other parts of the hormone in order to see if there really is a problem right there. But it is very common, especially with women. Now there's hyperthyroidism, not as common. That's when you're producing too much. Okay, so it causes there to be like a nervousness. So it's like opposite of what the other one. Instead of that kind of, you're kind of hyper, irritable, nervous. You're fatigued only because you're nervous and irritable all the time. So it makes you tired, but you can't sleep. You don't tolerate heat very well. You can have tremors. A heartbeat is beating fast. There might be diarrhea instead of constipation. There might be unexplained weight loss. And then there can form a goiter, which is an excess thyroid can produce a swollen part in your neck. I'll show you that in just a minute. Another thing is this deal with the bulging eyes. You can see this poor person over here. The eyes will start to bulge out. Just think of everything just running too fast. Everything's just going too fast. And so therefore, for hyperthyroidism, the only way to deal with that is surgically. So we can see these little girls right here. This girl has a problem. This is called a goiter. Okay, so that is the thyroid gland. And what happens is, since the body is not recognizing the hormone being produced, the thyroid keeps producing more and more and more. So the metabolism is not functioning properly. The gland starts to overproduce, but it's not being absorbed at all. And it causes this goiter. So the only thing to do at this point is to surgically remove part of the thyroid. Now, especially if there happens to be a cancer, like a tumor, if the entire thyroid gland has to be removed, then that patient will have to be on thyroid medication the rest of their life. Okay? Oftentimes what happens is these people are probably in a country where they didn't get medical attention very quickly, and they let it go out of control. If this person had been dealt with earlier, perhaps they would have made that goiter problem, and they would have taken it out earlier, and it wouldn't got so big, and they could maybe have saved part of the thyroid that way. The parathyroids are actually embedded into the thyroid gland. There are 4 of them. And if somebody needs to have their thyroid removed, they do go in there and take the parathyroid out and leave those in the body. Okay, so they don't remove those along with the thyroid. But they control calcium in the blood and the bones. They're crucial for a proper function of the nervous and muscular system. If we have too much calcium, we can have a problem. We can go into a coma. So we don't want too much calcium. We'll go into a coma. If we have too little calcium, huge problem. We'll have a seizure. Each condition can cause us to die. It can cause death. So we got to take care of those. Right now, you probably have no idea anything about your thyroid or parathyroid because they're functioning beautifully. Thank you, God, for that. Our adrenal glands. Okay, these are sitting right on top of the kidneys. 1, 2. And they produce something called cortisol, which causes the liver to release glucose into the blood. Okay, so cortisol would be sort of the awake hormone. Okay, so we want that to be when we're in the daytime. We're going to be releasing glucose because we're moving around. We're needing our bodies to be working hard, that kind of thing. They also release something called adrenaline, okay, also known as epinephrine. Do I have that on the slide? Maybe I do. There are zones of it. It's shaped like this. We have these. This is too much information for you, but I wanted to show you. It releases aldosterone, which helps blood pressure regulation. Cortisol, the awake thing for increasing blood sugar, and androgens, those are for males, for their stuff right here. And they produce, in the middle, they produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. That produces what is known as the fight or flight response. So you probably felt this before. For instance, in a good way, maybe if you were on a roller coaster and it was really kind of, exciting and you're going up and down there and you get off and you're kind of shaking like, oh my goodness, that was so amazing. That's your hormone, okay? In a bad way, like for instance, when I'm driving, if somebody in front of me stops short and I have to slam on my brakes and I almost hit them, then I'm shaking, right? That's that hormone that's been released. And it causes you to react in such a way that you will do something, slam on the brakes or enjoy your ride on the roller coaster. There are times when people, the fight or flight meaning I'm going to stay and fight, or I'm going to run away. All right. There have been indications or here's what it looks like on the inside. I just wanted to give you all this. It's very complex that way. Okay. So there have been incidents that take place where somebody reacts with the fight or flight. For instance, if a parent accidentally is in the car backing up and they run over their child, that parent can have the strength to lift the car off the child. That has happened. And it has to do with the adrenaline that's being released from the adrenal glands. And it causes us, for just a moment to have superhuman strength. And we can do things like that. That's the fight part of it. Also, it'll make you, if you're scared, and you'll say, I got to get out of here. It's God's way of saying, this is danger, get out of here, run away. That's the flight part of it. So fascinating, okay? Remember, adrenaline is the same thing as epinephrine. There's just a different name for it. Adrenaline because it comes from the adrenal gland. Okay. The endocrine system uses something called feedback loops to help regulate this. It keeps the body from producing too much or not enough of a hormone. So the hypothalamus releases, right here we have thyroid releasing hormone. Then it goes to the anterior pituitary, which releases thyroid stimulating hormone, which goes to the thyroid gland, which then releases T3, T4. Now there's enough. That goes back and tells the hypothalamus stop. All right, so that's called a feedback loop. Our pancreas. Remember, we've learned about the pancreas because it was part of the digestive system. It released digestive juices into the small intestine. So that is it's a gland called an exocrine gland. But endocrine gland means that the endocrine, it's going to release the hormone into the blood. That's important, into the bloodstream. So it's going to be, we've seen it, it's close to our stomach, right? It's right down here. We'll see that in our rat next week. And so it's going to release a very specialized hormone called insulin. Okay, it releases insulin and another one called glucagon in these special little islets right here. These are the cells that release the digestive enzymes, so the exocrine function. And in this islet right here called the islet of Langerhans, islet is like an island, the island of Langerhans, and in there these hormones are released, and they are released into the bloodstream. All right, insulin and glucagon, and those each have their own function. And we're going to talk about specifically insulin, okay, because it has to do with this disease called diabetes. So the pancreas secretes the insulin. It's a protein. It helps to usher the glucose into the cells. It's kind of like the escort of the glucose into the cells. If someone does not produce enough insulin, they suffer from this thing called type 1 diabetes mellitus. And it can be treated because, once again, fortunately, we have come up with a synthetic version of insulin that will act almost in the same way. I mean, it's really, really good. It's really close. Of course, they have to give themselves injections, which is kind of a bummer. Type 2 diabetes can develop in people who lose some of the receptors. The receptors no longer recognize the insulin. And sometimes when that happens, then over time, the body will start making less insulin as well. So they can usually be treated by changes to the diet. They kind of spread their meals out over the day and this kind of thing. So they're not overloaded with any glucose at any particular time. That's called type 2 diabetes. Much more common, by the way. So type 1 right here, we have decreased insulin. and therefore glucose cannot go into the cells, so it stays in the blood. Our muscles get weaker right here. They don't have enough insulin in there. And furthermore, that glucose, where does it end up? It ends up in the urine, right? In the urine. And then we can do a urine test with one of those little sticks and find the glucose and say, oh my goodness, there should not be glucose in this urine. Okay. We have glycogen and protein breakdown causing ketoacidosis, which can be a life-threatening problem. The protein gets broken down, and it's not broken down properly. Okay, so symptoms of this would be using the bathroom a lot, feeling drowsy and sleepy all the time, losing weight, very thirsty, sometimes blurry vision, sometimes more hungry. So you eat and eat and eat, and you don't gain weight. All right, I will tell you that type 1 diabetes is something that is genetic, okay? So you're born with it. I have had students in the past who were diabetic. In fact, I had one class one time that I had 2 students who were diabetic. One girl knew since she was 5 years old, and she had a little pump that was implanted into her body that released insulin. So she didn't have to give injections to herself. That was kind of nice, right? The other one was a boy, and it was interesting. He was a twin boy, and his twin sister was fine. She didn't have diabetes, but he came down with it at age 14 when he started noticing these kind of symptoms. Mostly it was the weight loss. He's a guy, he was trying to build up muscle, and he just couldn't gain any weight. They went and got him checked out. It turns out he had type 1 diabetes. And he was only 16 when I knew him, so he would still giving himself injections. And he probably was going to have to deal with that the rest of his life. And so that usually though, type 1 diabetes you know about since you were a young child. So you would already know by now typically. Type 2, which is much more common, actually comes on later. Okay, so what happens is we have enough insulin at the beginning, enough insulin secreted, but our muscle doesn't use it properly. Okay, so it's resistant to the insulin. You can kind of think about it as a little doorways on the cells that let the glucose in, that they're not opening properly. Okay, they just kind of closed and they won't open anymore, and that once again causes the same problem with your muscles. They're not getting enough glucose. Okay, so we have the same problem there, but then we have other problems. Obesity and factors will continue, right? They will increase. I think, yeah, here are the symptoms of uncontrolled diabetes. Notice it says uncontrolled. In other words, we're not dealing with it properly. You have to use the bathroom a lot because you're thirsty, you have blurry vision, you have hunger, you feel drowsy. So very similar things, but there are other things as well. Slow healing of wounds and bruises, and tingling and numbness, especially in the hands and feet. That can get bad enough that it cuts off blood supply to those, and you end up having to get feet or hands, typically feet, amputated. Yikes. And so the best way to deal with type 2 is to keep yourself healthy. How does it develop in people? Typically people who have a poor diet. I will say there are some genetic factors to it. For instance, African Americans have a much higher rate of type 2 diabetes. And so some of it has to do with culture. In other words, the food we're eating, our sad American diet, right? Standard American diet, which is kind of sad. We need to be eating, healthy foods, eat the rainbow, right? We discussed this kind of thing. And try to keep, obesity is probably the biggest problem. So try to keep a good weight, do some, exercise, things like this. If you have a predisposition due to your heritage or something like that, you might need to take extra steps. But most of us just need to keep ourselves healthy. Are you at risk? Well, knowing your family history is important. Do you have a family member with type 1 diabetes? And furthermore, you probably would know by now if you had type 1 diabetes. If you're descended from certain racial groups like Native Americans, African Americans, or Pacific Americans, that would be people like who would be Hawaiian, right? That kind of thing. And then healthy diet and exercise regularly. And I'm not talking about running marathons. Just get up and move. Get your lymphatic system moving. Get yourself moving. Eat healthy foods. Make healthy choices, right? Here are risk factors. Age for type 2. Age. You get older and you have more chance of having that. Obesity, number 1, pretty much. Inactivity. But remember, sometimes you're feeling kind of tired, like, oh, I don't want to move around. Yeah, but you need to get up and move around. Pregnancy. So women will go through what's known as gestational diabetes, meaning during pregnancy they can have that. If they have that, then they have a greater chance of becoming diabetic later on. I never had gestational diabetes, so I'm happy about that. Family history is big. And then this just pre-diabetes, it has to do with indicators early, where if you're spilling glucose in your urine regularly, something like that. High cholesterol, high blood pressure, those can all lend toward risk factors for diabetes. Okay, now we're at lab time right here, and we're going to do our lab on the kidneys. Okay, I don't really have any hormone labs to do. So, although I could get you, like, go for a ride on a roller coaster, right? You get your adrenaline pumping, something like that. But here what I have is a jar. I think I have this is a video, yeah, of making my urine, my kidney model right there. Okay, so let's see what I have to say. Okay, here's my little model. This is sort of just my little homemade model right here. So you can see what I have is I have some red pony beads right here and then some white ones. So these would be our red blood cells and our white blood cells. Okay, so this is the solid portion of blood, right? So we're looking at blood right here. So we have a liquid portion of blood as well. So as the process, so you can see down there. So I'm going to pour the liquid portion in right now. Just water. Big of a mess. All right, there we go. And as we go through the processes in our bodies, we tend to make some byproducts. Notice that it's yellow, right? So these are some waste products that we're going to need to get rid of, okay? So now I want you to think of my jar here as a model of the kidney, the Bowman's capsule. This would be the Bowman's capsule and the nephron right here. Okay, so you see what happens is as all of the blood, so this is all the blood, right, is going through the nephron, it's going to go through the Bowman's capsule and it's going to slam all of it against this filter right here. Watch what happens. Okay, so there's all my solid parts still left in the nephron, and what's in the kidney now? That's right, y'all. Urine. Okay, it's not real urine, just food coloring. Okay, very good. Okay, and so then, remember what's going to happen next is that the water portion of that, the water portion will go back into the bloodstream, right? That's what the kidney's going to do. It's going to pull the water back in. So if I could have had the model where I could pour back in and not be yellow anymore, that would have been cool, right? So, but the yellow part's going to stay in. And remember that video we watched earlier on that talked about if I have been drinking enough water during the day, then what will happen is that my kidneys will make lots and lots of urine, and the urine will be what we call dilute urine. The urine will be very lightly colored yellow because there's a lot of water in it. But if you're not drinking enough water, then your urine will become very concentrated, and that means it's going to be very dark yellow. So if you see dark yellow urine after you urinate, you need to go drink some water, okay? And there are certain things that will act on your kidneys and fake your kidneys out. They'll think that you have enough water when you don't. And the number one, they're called diuretics. And diuretics will actually, they pull fluid out of your body. Sometimes we need fluid out of our body. For instance, if we have fluid buildup around the heart, that's called congestive heart failure. We need to pull that fluid. It's in the kind of the casing around the heart. We need to pull that fluid out. So we'll give you some diuretics. It's a type of medication. But a natural diuretic, there's a couple out there. The number one is caffeine. All right, so you may have noticed this. If you drink a lot of caffeinated beverage, boy, howdy, you have to go to the bathroom a lot, right? And the deal is it's faking your kidneys out, thinking you have enough water when you don't. So therefore, if you are thirsty, the last thing you want to drink is something with caffeine in it, okay? Because it will not hydrate you. All right, little preaching going on here. Right now I'm drinking my hot tea here in the morning because, we like to have a little bit of caffeine in the morning, right? But I also have my cup of water next to me to keep me hydrated. All right, so make sure and keep your kidneys healthy. You know how important they are. You got to keep those kidneys healthy by drinking plenty of good water all day long. All right, I have another kidney model coming up. This one was almost a fiasco right here. For some reason, it was really acting up. You'll see in the video. I'm glad I didn't do this at school, actually. You'll see why. This is a little filter type of a thing. It's called dialysis tubing, and it looks like a little piece of, clear papery type stuff, but really, if you dunk it down into the water, you can actually turn it into, this is a piece, and you kind of do that to it until it opens up. There it goes, and I have one already open here. So this one I opened up for us already, and I tied the bottom of it with a little bit of string, so it's just an empty tube. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill it up with this simulated blood. Okay, it's not real blood. This, I might have had a little trouble with this at ODA, right, because of the rule against red liquids. Right. All right, so we can see this. So this is going to once again be acting like our nephron with the blood coming into it. All right there like that. Oops. Is that coming out the bottom? If it is, I got to tie my little thing tighter. Okay. All right, so I'm going to tie the top of this, and I'll be right back. Hold on. All right, so it looks like I have a crime scene over here because I had a lot of this spill out here. But now I've got it in my tube, and I hope it's not leaking anymore, okay? But the first thing I need to do is that in my beaker right here, I'm going to put it down in this beaker of fresh, clean water. Let's leave that sitting there for just a second. Right here, fresh, clean water. And I'm going to test this water for a couple of things. Here is my first test strip, which is testing for salt. Okay, notice there's not anything on there. So no salt in the water. I'm using, oops, I'll put that somewhere. There's our salt one. And the other one we're testing for is a chemical known as urea. All right, so I will test my water for that. Okay, there we go. You can see change making there. And now I'm going to take this little apparatus here, and I'm going to drop it down. So my little apparatus here, I'm going to drop it down into this clean water, like that. And so now what you can see is we have it sitting in the water like that. Okay, yeah. Okay, and now I'm going to stop the thing and clean up a little bit, and I'll come back and I'll leave it a little bit of time, and we're going to see what happens. Okay, this is, we would have set this up at the beginning of class and then see what it does at the end. Okay, I'll be back. Okay, yeah, so that turned into like a mess, big time, okay, and I had blood everywhere. Not real blood, right? My hands are still stained with that stuff. So here's how it's set up first. Okay, so I set it up. Now this dialysis tubing is a special kind of tubing. It's called a selectively permeable membrane. All right, so what it will let some things go through and other things it won't let go through. So notice my water's clear. There's none of the red in the water right there. Okay, here's our little strips right here. We had negative for salt and negative for urea. Now some time went by and it looked like this. Okay, so something inside the bag came out of the bag, but not the red stuff. Okay, what came out of the bag was this yellow stuff. All right, it was able to pass through the selectively permeable membrane of the nephron there. And then these are my old strips. I can't see my new strips on here. It tested positive for salt, so salt passed out of the membrane into the water. And it tested positive for urea, which passed out of the membrane into the water. But the larger things, whatever this red stuff is, did not pass through. And that's how the kidney works. It selects what's going to pass through. And it selects for the urea, which would be the waste products, the salt, maybe some water to come through, and for other solid portions to stay in. All right, so that was our little kidney model. I believe your book has a kidney model you can do. It mostly has to do with water, I think, traveling through it, like a paper towel or something like that. So try that. If you do, send me a picture of it, and I'll get you extra credit for that. Okay, y'all, that is it for our kidneys and endocrine system. Next week, we will look all at the lymphatic system, also a fascinating system. It's your immune system, how you stay well. And then we'll dissect our little rat next week. Okay, gang, have a great week. See you soon, I hope.